So this is part 2 of my video on Quakerism, and in this video I want to talk a little bit more about how Quakerism is practiced and what you might expect to find if you decided to attend a Quaker meeting. Let's get into it. So I like to, first of all, use the word Quaker because that's what most people are familiar with. They've seen Quaker oats, they've heard the word, they kind of have an idea of what it means. But the actual term that people who practice this type of faith use is friends. So anytime you see a religious house or a sign that says it's a friends meeting, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about Quakerism. So what does it look like if you practice a religion where you believe that no one should be in charge of what God's word is, and everyone is equal and everyone has the equal access to the divine? What does that look like? Well, first of all, Friends do not have churches, they have meeting halls. They do not have an organized religious body. They certainly have gatherings, they have conferences, they get together, they talk to each other, they attend each other's meetings, but they do not have a religious organization. There is no one in charge of the Religious Society of Friends. It does not happen. The way that the faith is practiced varies quite a bit, as you might imagine, because everyone has access to the divine, so everyone can decide how they want to worship. But there's a few guidelines. So one thing that you might see, like a big difference you see between Quaker meetings, is they have organized Quaker meetings and unorganized Quaker meetings. Most Quaker meetings are unorganized, but there are a few Quaker meetings that are organized, which means they will more closely resemble Protestant Christian services that you will have attended if you have grown up with any of the more mainstream Protestant denominations. Like, they'll have a sermon and they'll have some songs that they'll sing together, and they'll do some readings from maybe the Bible, maybe some Quaker philosophers, or whatever readings they choose. So it'll look a little bit more like a regular religious meeting, but there is no minister, there is no preacher, there is no one in charge. Anyone who's giving a sermon that day will just be a member of the society. Now let's talk about unorganized meetings. So this is how most Friends practice their faith, and this is what that looks like. So Quakerism prioritizes what they call plain speaking, which means they tend to not, certainly back in England, they wouldn't give people like lords and ladies, they would not use their titles. They would refuse to use their titles because they didn't want to put any kind of social difference between people. So sort of natural socialists, the Quakers. And they also rejected a lot of other pieces of artifice, which, I don't know if it makes sense or not. Feels a little culty, honestly, but I'm allowed to have that opinion because it's Quakerism. They will say like first through the seventh day, so they don't say Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. They say first through the seventh day. So if you ever go to a Quaker meeting or a Friends meeting, they usually take place on the seventh day, which is the day of rest on Sunday. But the Berkeley Friends meeting also had services on third days, which is Wednesday. And you would arrive and file into a room. It's often laid out in a circle because you're not facing a pulpit or anything. And you sit, and someone has been designated for that day to announce the rise of meeting, and you will sit in silence, and that's what the worship is. And you will spend time thinking about yourself and your divine spark. In the Friends tradition, they call it the spirit. because it's a little bit more inclusive than this idea of God. You don't have to believe in God. You just have to believe in a divine higher power. So it kind of feels a little bit like an AA meeting, but without the baggage. You just have to believe in a higher power, but you don't have to believe in a specific kind. It doesn't have to be like a dude with a white beard. That's it. And they don't really care how you feel about Jesus. Some people are really into Jesus. I mean, it did come out of Christianity, so it's very common for people to think of Jesus as the Son of God or to be a divine figure, but it's not important. It's not a deal breaker if you don't believe in him. So you go in and you sit in silence, and anyone can speak at any time about anything. And it is your call as the person who is there in this religious practice to listen to that person, knowing that they have access to the divine and that the divine is speaking through them. And that doesn't mean you have to buy into what they're saying. It doesn't mean that you have to agree with what you're saying. It just means you have to practice compassion and find the divine in what they're saying. And then the person who's designated to say that it's the rise of meaning will say it's the rise of meaning, and then they'll have some announcements, and then they will ask anyone who's visiting from another meeting to introduce themselves. And the call for people who practice this faith is to speak plainly, so they like you to stand up and say your name nice and loud and be real straightforward. The practice means that of plain speaking means that some friends have no filter. You're supposed to just say what you mean. That's sort of the goal of the philosophy. Now, what's I think really funny is that I just described an unorganized Quaker meeting where they have a rise of meeting, which means that someone stands up and says, this is the rise of meeting, the meeting is over. The biggest schism that they had in the early years of Quakerism, one of the biggest schisms, one of the biggest arguments, and this is hilarious to me, is that there was a deep disagreement about whether they should use clocks to decide when the end of the service was, or if they should just feel when the service ended. And of course, for me, I'm just like, yeah, of course you need to use a clock, because otherwise it'll just drag and drag and drag and drag. And I'm sure people were like, we kind of wanted to go back to our houses and eat, And so I deeply sympathize with the people who wanted to use a clock. But I think back in the day, there were some really strong feelings about using a clock to show the end of meeting. But this type of service is how Friends do everything. Wedding services within the Friends tradition is also a service where people sit in silence and friends are just invited to speak about the couple or speak about anything. And that is how they do wedding ceremonies. That's it. Nobody's in charge. Your friends just gather, and in silence they bless your union. So what are the downsides of this type of religious practice? Well, and I wouldn't say that they're downsides, but they're things that you should think about if you are thinking about looking into joining a religious society of friends. One of those things is because nobody's in charge, it's a lot of committees. So if you don't like committees, if you don't have patience with them, if you want things to get done quickly, it's not going to work for you, because everybody comes to a group decision. That's how the decisions are made. There are subcommittees that make it a little bit more efficient. There are certainly people who are influential in these societies, but everybody's opinion matters, and you're going to have to deal with that if you're going to be a part of it. But one thing I think is really cool about this religious practice is you don't actually have to join an already existing Society of Friends. You could start your own Quaker meeting if you want. And in the early days of this religious practice, people would just meet in their homes. You really just need 2 people to have a Quaker meeting, and you can invoke the spirit anywhere with anyone. So if you want to start your own, I say great. Please go forth. You will meet some really, really nice, genuine folks. And hope to see you at the next meeting. but also no pressure because there's no dogma, so it doesn't actually matter because you are already divine. So